Hey everyone, Mortgage Nerd here. So I want to give you an update on the housing bubble. There's going to be several of these. Why updating on the housing bubble? That if you watch my videos, you know I don't think there is a bubble. Because look at this right here. Google Trends is showing the term housing bubble as being the highest that it's been in a long time. So it's trending a lot more than it has been since the pandemic started. And so let's address some of this stuff. So one of the things that I saw recently after another video that I made on the housing bubble is this chart right here. So homes built in the United States by decade. Right now, this last decade that we just finished, 2010 to 2019, we had 20%, a fraction, 1/5 of the housing starts of the new homes built than we had the decade before, from 2000 to 2009. Why? I mean, the market crashed, so builders stopped building. They were scared. There was a huge issue. The Great Recession, if you don't know about it. You probably do know about it. That's why you think there's a housing bubble. That's why you're watching this video. If there's all this supply that isn't there, that should have been there, because population is rising, we're going to get into that in a minute, then how do you get the supply? Supply and demand. If there's very little supply and there's a lot of demand, then the prices go up. That's why we have inflation. That's why we have all these issues in our economy right now everywhere. Cars, boats, grocery store aisles are empty. Everything. Inflation is driving all of this. Now, just for some other perspective, the last time that new homes built was this low was in the 1930s. Before we entered World War II, right? After World War II, we had a boom in our economy. Before the baby boomers, which was after the war, everybody had babies, and that's where we're going to get into this now in a second, of birth rates. The 1950s was the peak of birth rates up until recently. I mean, I don't know how else to tell you. Supply is a huge driver in prices. There was very little supply starting this decade with the pandemic coming in. So let's go into demand. So this is a new birth rate chart. I used a different one in other videos, and I'm going to keep using it because this is what drives demand. So the peak of birth rates, the baby boomers, was up here, 4.3 million at the end of the 50s. So the 50s, we had this huge boom, right? Let's go down to, this is where there was the beginning of contraception in the 60s. Then birth rates peaked a bit again. Then they dropped. Why? Because of Roe versus Wade. It says it right there. I've said it before as a correlation, but now this chart says it right there. And this is from the CDC. So now let's look at millennials. These are the millennials. This is the time frame where millennials were born. And up here is their peak, 1990. So what am I trying to say here? When Roe versus Wade happened and we had that drop in birth rates, you had 33 years to that, which is the average first-time home buyer. Remember, a first-time home buyer is not selling a house to buy another one. They are buying a house. They are creating demand and they are taking away from the supply. They are not adding to the supply. So 33 years after the mid-70s is 2008. Is the market crash. The demand, this is not why. We all know it's because of the rampant fraud in mortgages, these pick-a-pay loans, these people that couldn't afford the house. They made $30,000 and they're buying $1 million house. I mean, we knew that that was all the reason, the catalyst, but you still have supply and demand. Supply was high. Remember that those builders in that chart. Demand was low because there wasn't enough first-time home buyers buying their first homes. Well, where are we now? 1990 was the peak. You had 33 years. That's next year. That's 2023. So we are at the peak of demand for millennials, the largest portion of our population right now, the largest portion of birth rates ever in history, because it was more than the peak of birth rates slightly, but still more than the peak of birth rates for the baby boomers. So demand is at an all-time high, yet the builders did not build any supply in the last decade. Why do people still think there's a bubble and something's going to crash? I'll tell you a little bit more why they think and why it's not correct in my upcoming videos. Mortgage Nerd out.